In 1936, British Egyptologist Walter Bryan Emery came across a small object in the desert, 60 centimeters in diameter and 10 centimeters high, which sparked heated debate. Was it a masterfully crafted stone model of a flying saucer, or even some kind of hyper-engine of a spacecraft brought to Earth by an advanced civilization? Emery had conducted excavations along the Nile Valley for many years, particularly in the extensive ancient necropolis of Saqqara, and during this work unearthed countless finds illustrating the wealth of ancient Egypt. The most unusual and mysterious of these was an item recovered from the tomb of a high-ranking official named Sabu. The nature and origin of Sabu himself remain unclear to scholars. Sources differ, and some suggest he may have been a son of the pharaoh. The very fact of his burial at Saqqara indicates a high position at the royal court, yet his early life and the role fate assigned him remain matters of conjecture. Inside his mastaba, archaeologists revealed 7 burial chambers, each filled with ordinary funerary goods: animal bones, flint tools, pottery, ivory objects, and stone bowls. And it was precisely among these commonplace necropolis items that a damaged artifact suddenly appeared, later dubbed the Sabu disc. Externally, the disc resembles a shallow bowl with a rounded bottom. Around its perimeter are 3 elegantly carved curved lobes, spaced from one another at roughly 120-degree intervals. These blades are separated by 3 holes, and at the very center of the disc, there is a thin central channel, a tube. The material from which the object was made is called olevrolite, or shale, a very brittle rock. It readily splits and crumbles under pressure. This is what makes the origin and manufacture of the disc especially baffling. How such a complex shape could have been turned from such a fragile stone using the simplest stone or copper tools as early as 3000 BCE remains a dilemma. Equally puzzling is the question of why Sabu was interred with this item beside him. If the true purpose of the disc were known, much about its burial context would become clearer. Upon its initial discovery, archaeologists leaned toward more prosaic explanations, suggesting it might have been merely a vessel, a container for incense, or a ceremonial ornament. Those who examined the artifact from an engineering perspective concluded that it might not have been a standalone object, but part of a more complex mechanism. An amateur historian made an exact copy of the disc using a modern 3D printer, and these replicas led to, when the replica was placed in a special housing and spun at high speed using a thin central shaft, the disc proved capable of moving water, creating a flow in a specific direction. And during tests outside the casing, in the open air, it produced a powerful vortex, which only emphasized the effectiveness of the shape. Thus, it became clear that the curved blades and the slight concavity of the disc's surface were not accidental. These elements appear to be deliberately designed to work with liquids. The design was likely intended to move water with high efficiency, essentially performing the functions of a centrifugal pump. The whole way of life in ancient Egypt depended largely on irrigating fields and managing water resources. Later dynasties refined the basin irrigation system and learned to control the lifting of water to extract maximum benefit for agriculture. In this light, it becomes plausible to suggest that engineers of the first dynasty may have experimented with advanced irrigation methods thousands of years earlier than the dates usually attributed by archaeologists and historians. Nevertheless, some specialists express doubts. The slate from which the disc was made may be insufficiently durable for long-term use as a working pump component. Therefore, in scientific circles, it could be a stone imitation of something originally made of metal that belonged to a civilization possibly much older and technologically more advanced than ancient Egypt itself. The reaction to the find also spawned bolder hypotheses. One Swiss author suggested the disc is a copy of a part of a hyperdrive from an extraterrestrial ship, or even a stone model of a flying saucer. A French researcher expressed the opinion that such a disc might have served as part of a sealed process for producing sodium carbonate inside the pyramids. Other scholars and enthusiasts allow for more prosaic options. Finally, it is not excluded that we may be looking at a giant lamp, yet another of the many versions explaining the purpose of the mysterious object. Another historical puzzle is connected with a map of 1513, which is considered the oldest surviving map depicting both American continents, North and South America. Its author is named as the Turkish captain Piri Reis, who, despite never having crossed the ocean himself, managed to compile this map by accumulating information from numerous sources. For the work, he used a total of 20 regional maps, combining them to create a single composite chart. Among these sources were an Arabic map of India and 4 Portuguese charts, showing India and China. The last of these maps was lost for many years, which makes the Piri Reis map all the more valuable as evidence of what Columbus might have observed during his third voyage to the New World. The American historian Charles Hapgood, who studied this material in detail, suggested that the map might depict Antarctica in a prehistoric era, because the coastline contours somehow resembled the true shoreline of the continent at a time when it was free of ice. However, this hypothesis was later refuted, and today such an explanation is considered incorrect. Another sensation that shocked the scientific community was the so-called Klerksdorp spheres. These objects were found in deposits of the mineral pyrophyllite in South Africa. In appearance, they resemble small ancient cricket bats with a noticeable line down the middle. The 1980s saw bold interpretations emerge. A theory arose that the spheres could have been made by some highly developed antediluvian civilization of which nothing else has reached us. One journalist claimed that the spheres rotated by themselves while in a display case, and a participant on a television show calling himself a psychic assured the public that these spheres were wreckage from an ancient spacecraft. Nevertheless, most geologists explain the Klerksdorp spheres much more prosaically. In their view, they are ordinary spherical formations that arose from minerals different in composition from the surrounding rock. The lines resembling seams are interpreted as traces of the rock's layered structure, imprinted and built up over time. The shape of these objects is indeed varied, from slightly flattened spheres to almost perfect disks. As for the case of one sphere allegedly rotating on its own, the curator of the Klerksdorp Museum gave a simple and understandable explanation. When he, during a journalist's visit, placed one of the spheres on a glass shelf, it turned slightly simply because it was round and could roll freely. Gold is mined near the museum, and because of this, the ground beneath its foundation experiences small jolts from time to time. In one of the remote regions of China, there are strange natural formations known as the Baigong pipes. A local researcher first drew attention to them in 1996, discovering formations on Mount Baigong and on the shore of Lake Tosan nearby. Some inhabitants of those places believed that such structures could have appeared thanks to the activity of ancient visitors from other planets. When scientists analyzed samples of the pipe material, they found that common minerals predominated in their composition, but that they also contained about 8% of a substance whose nature remains unclear. Additional laboratory studies showed that these columnar structures existed long before humans appeared in that area. Later, Chinese geologists visited the site and proposed a more down-to-earth origin, natural formation of these pipes. One explanation claims they could be petrified roots of ancient trees that once grew here during a period when the landscape was noticeably greener. Nevertheless, there is still no definitive, widely accepted answer to the question of the origin of the Baigong pipes, and the phenomenon remains the subject of debate and speculation. While digging trenches along a river in Romania, workers came across a metal wedge, now known as the Iude aluminum wedge, or simply the Iude object. Mastodon bones were found near the discovery. These distant relatives of modern elephants lived roughly 11,000 years ago, leading some scientists to conclude that the wedge itself is of comparable ancient age. Particularly surprising is the composition of the object. It is made of aluminum, a metal only officially characterized in the 18th century. Producing aluminum requires substantial heating and technological preparation. It is also reported that a dense layer of oxide lies on the wedge's surface, estimated to have formed over many hundreds of years. Some propose that the object may have arrived here together with debris from an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Other researchers consider the find a hoax, and still others allow that the wedge is a product of human manufacture whose purpose is not yet known. In the area of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, researchers once overlooked a tall, pink granite vessel buried in the ground a few kilometers from the monument. This oval tubular container remained unnoticed for a long time, though it could have given rise to new hypotheses. Some supporters of unorthodox theories believe that such items indicate that Egyptian priests and builders used the pyramids not only as tombs and monuments, but also as devices for generating and harnessing electricity. In their view, experimentation with electricity was allegedly conducted long before inventors such as Volta and Edison appeared. These ideas remain controversial and are not confirmed by conclusive evidence, but the finds themselves provide material for further research and reflection. The Giza Plateau is best known for three main pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. But alongside these giants stand two less conspicuous structures: the unfinished northern pyramid of Zawiat el-Aryan and the so-called layered pyramid. Scholars still dispute their fate. Some believe these structures were never completed, while others think they once stood finished, but were destroyed for unknown reasons. One explanation for their destruction or unfinished state is there are hypotheses that ascribe unusual functions to them, up to and including the role of some kind of electricity generator. To trace the threads of these ideas, it is worth returning to early 20th century excavations. It was then that the Italian architect and Egyptologist Alessandro Barsanti began investigating the northern pyramid of Zawiat el-Aryan. During work nearby, he noticed pieces of granite scattered on the surface of the ground. At first glance, to Barsanti, however, these fragments looked suspicious. Apparently, the ancient Egyptians often used such sites for preliminary dressing of stones before transporting them to their installation site. The fact that the debris included granite particularly attracted the researchers' attention. Granite was a more expensive and labor-intensive material to work than the common limestone used in the construction of most pyramids. Barsanti deepened the excavations, and at a depth of 20 meters, came across a huge block of pink granite. Continuing the dig, he also discovered stone slabs with inscriptions and symbols carved on them. He sent one of the finds for analysis, but the meaning of those symbols could not be deciphered at the time. No one could give a definitive explanation of what they meant or to whom they were addressed. This raised new questions. Were the inscriptions directions and instructions for some device or process? Barsanti's most startling discovery was an oval vessel carved from the same pink granite, and the vessel had been carefully sealed, and when opened, a thin layer of black residue was found along the inner walls, a thick, oily substance resembling resin or a petroleum-like material. The discovery of this carefully sealed container raised many questions for Barsanti. Why had the ancient craftsman needed to close and protect this particular vessel so securely? Unfortunately, further searches and attempts to find clear answers did not last long. By 1911, Barsanti was forced to stop the excavations and abandon attempts to determine what exactly that mysterious pit concealed. His discoveries aroused lively interest among researchers around the world, and many of them formed their own ideas about the possible role of the structures. One modern hypothesis suggests that not individual pyramids, but several similar structures could have functioned as an interconnected system. According to this view, the Pyramid of Khufu was not merely a tomb, but was used as a kind of water pump intended to modify and control water flow in the desert. Proponents believe that the pyramid's internal chambers and channels could have formed a hydraulic complex operating as part of such a system. In particular, in the 1990s, an engineer took this hypothesis seriously and investigated underground rooms at the base of the pyramid. To his surprise, the chambers he examined showed traces of damage. A separate thesis in this chain of ideas proposes that the pyramid generated powerful compression waves, or pulses, that could produce electricity. This raised the important and intriguing question: could the ancient Egyptians have used pyramids as generators of electricity? Theoretical calculations and paper studies were presented to demonstrate this possibility, but determining the original purpose of the structures with absolute certainty proved extremely difficult. Consequently, there is still no definitive, unambiguous confirmation of this version. Meanwhile, Egypt remains the scene of significant archaeological discoveries that shed light on humanity's past. Scientists recently uncovered a structure resembling a space command center from a science fiction film. It is an L-shaped astronomical observatory of about 800 square meters, dated to the 6th century BC. This structure is recognized as the first and largest observatory of its time. The mud brick building housed instruments used to calculate dates related to ancient Egyptian rituals, pharaonic coronations, and agricultural planning. The observatory is located on an archaeological site known as the Temple of Buto, roughly 80 kilometers east of Alexandria. The building was designed with its entrance facing east, to greet the sunrise and to observe celestial phenomena at the moment light appears. In one of the rooms, archaeologists discovered an impressive sundial, used to determine time by the movement of shadows inside the chamber. These internal clocks were unusually large. Their length was almost 5 meters, and the find itself generated great interest among researchers. Such devices could be observed from within an enclosed space, which makes them especially valuable for understanding the daily life of ancient inhabitants. No less striking was the discovery of the world's first pregnant mummy, reported by Egyptologists. Although much is already known about embalming techniques, modern excavations continue to produce astonishing evidence that allows a glimpse into the private lives of the ancient Egyptians. It was discovered with great difficulty that this woman had been pregnant at the time of embalming, primarily because she had been placed in a sarcophagus intended for a man, probably a priest. Such placement contradicted researchers' expectations and complicated the initial identification. Historians explain such oddities by a 19th century practice among tomb traders. To increase their profits, this took archaeologists by surprise, because when opening tombs, they expected to obtain data about the health and lifestyles of specific individuals, but instead encountered evidence of later tampering. Nevertheless, researchers found another line of inquiry, the study of prenatal practices in ancient Egypt. The mummy of this woman, who lived roughly 2,000 years ago, shed light on such aspects. Expanded examinations determined that she was between 20 and 30 years old at the time of death, and the remains found in Thebes were exceptionally well preserved. Researchers also noted that special amulets had been used in her burial, suggesting affiliation. At the same time, the scientific team emphasizes that mummification recipes varied significantly by region and era in Egypt. It is these differences that prompt specialists. In addition, during excavations in Saqqara, archaeologists uncovered a burial area where 2 embalming workshops were located, one intended for people, the other for sacred animals. Preliminary estimates date these structures to roughly 2,400 years ago. Both workshops contained stone beds, clay pottery, and ritual vessels. In short, everything required for the mummification process. And that is not all. Archaeologists even came across cheese stored in jars that had been tightly sealed and are more than 3,000 years old. The presence of such a product in burials indicates that the ancient Egyptians were highly skilled in long-term food preservation. They knew how to preserve not only bodies, but also foodstuffs, and these finds vividly demonstrate the level of their practical knowledge in conservation. Moreover, scientists discovered one of the oldest Egyptian mummies completely covered in gold, which in itself is extremely rare. The condition of the body allowed conclusions about the high social status of the deceased. Based on the number and nature of the finds, scientists determined that these are the remains of a wealthy person named Geka Shefes. The presence of a headband and a pectoral bracelet, along with other symbols, indicated his importance and wealth in life. The mummy was dressed in a belted tunic, a way of preserving the deceased's dignified appearance even after death. To extract and study it, archaeologists opened the burial site by applying a solution, thereby gaining access to the materials and objects preserved inside. In essence, the scientists' work resembled opening a time capsule. From dead bodies, let us turn to the sky above the pyramids. To study that space, researchers used a high-precision radar, known as the Plerid, capable of detecting phenomena invisible to ordinary observation. With its help, scientists discovered giant plasma bubbles hovering over the pyramids. These structures have a destructive effect on modern technological systems. They can disrupt GPS and mobile signals over areas hundreds of kilometers in diameter around their location. The bubbles are enormous, sometimes comparable in size to cities, and, researchers believe, form due to sudden depletion of charged particles in the ionosphere. Instead of dispersing evenly through the ionosphere, These particles, this discovery is significant because it gives scientists a key to understanding the mechanisms that form such waves, and may eventually make it possible to find ways to prevent their occurrence so they do not interfere with our technology. If someone ever invents a time machine and you travel to the past, much of what seems familiar to you today will appear different and alien. The Statue of Liberty and the Egyptian pyramids, the simplest household devices like a remote control and a laptop, and even the corn you eat for lunch looked different in the past or did not exist. When the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere in Egypt were newly built, they did not look sandy brown and weathered. Their surfaces were covered with white limestone, and under the blazing African sun, such cladding would have dazzled the eyes with its smoothness and shine. Builders used approximately 6 million tons of this material to clad the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid remains the largest of those you can see on a modern trip to Egypt. Local authorities were economical and reused some of the casing stones for other building projects. In addition, a strong earthquake in the 14th century loosened and knocked some of these stones loose. So today, you will not see as many of them as once existed. Nevertheless, on the summit of the Hifrian Pyramid in Giza, individual layers of limestone still remain, and from a distance, this creates the illusion of a second, smaller peak above the main one. In antiquity, the tops of all pyramids, the so-called pyramidions, were covered with an alloy of gold and silver, which gave them extra brilliance. Most of these capstones have been lost. However, some artifacts have survived and are displayed in museums, where they often depict figures of Egyptian gods. Most likely, the shape of the pyramids was inspired by the image of the sacred pointed stone benben, which symbolized the sun's rays and served as a religious model. Of course, raising and setting multi-ton blocks without modern machinery was not easy. You would probably agree with this simple observation if you have ever helped friends move and dragged a heavy sofa up the stairs. The labor and fatigue involved do not seem new in the history of construction feats. The ancient Egyptians did not choose the pyramid shape by accident. It turns out to be ideal for evenly distributing weight throughout the structure, which is why monumental buildings were sturdy and stable for centuries. Lady Liberty has also undergone noticeable changes since her dedication in 1886. At the moment of the ceremony, she looked like a new copper coin, a warm brown and shiny hue. But already 20 years later, her appearance had changed. The statue is made of many thin sheets of copper, and when copper is in prolonged contact with the air, a protective film, a patina, gradually forms on it. This layer serves as a barrier against further corrosion, protecting the metal. When Lady Liberty first turned green, local authorities discussed the idea of restoring her original appearance by painting the surface. This debate took place long before the era of social media, so no one could express their outrage in comments under a post. Editors sought opinions from specialists, including makers of copper and bronze, who warned that removing the protective patina could lead to accelerated deterioration of the structure. Since then, proposals to repaint the statue have arisen more than once, but a final decision to repaint has not been made. Personally, I find it hard to imagine the figure in any color other than the one we have long been accustomed to. And now, about foods we take for granted. Wild bananas were once quite different. Inside their fruits were large, hard seeds, and there was little flesh, which was far from the modern tenderness. Thanks to targeted breeding, bananas became juicy and soft, allowing us to enjoy them in the familiar form. The history of the watermelon goes back more than 5,000 years. Originally, it had a bitter. Scientists in Japan went even further and developed seedless varieties of watermelon. Finally, the ancestor of maize is a Mexican grass known as teosinte, from which modern corn arose through cultivation and selection. The kernels on that grass were very tiny and hard to extract. Farmers many thousands of years ago selected and saved only those plants whose seeds were larger, tastier, or easier to grind. We owe those ancient farmers thanks for the corn we have today, which is edible and pleasant to eat. Imagine the wild avocados of that time. The fruits were so small they fit in the palm of your hand, and the pit inside occupied almost all the edible flesh. In addition, their skin and flesh were much tougher compared with the fruits we are accustomed to today. Probably without a computer, you would not be able to do many kinds of work now, although it's not easy to say exactly whom to thank for that. The ABC model, created in 1942, is considered one of the contenders for the title of the first computer. The name is short for a Tanisoff-Berry computer. The machine was named after its creators, who worked at the University of Iowa. The machine was enormous by modern standards and weighed more than 300 kilograms, so your modern laptop is almost certainly much lighter. This giant consisted of roughly 300 vacuum tubes and had a rotating drum slightly larger than a paint can, whose surface held small capacitors. Capacitors are components that can store electric charge, much like a battery, and they played an important role in the device's operation. The ABC could solve problems involving up to 29 different variables, allowing scientists to save a significant amount of time on calculations. Like modern computers, it operated in binary, ones and zeros, to represent numbers and other data, which enabled electronic computation. Curiously, the ABC performed one operation roughly every 15 seconds, whereas today our machines perform millions of operations per second. Unlike modern devices, the ABC had no memory for a stored, modifiable program, so it could perform only one task at a time. The operator had to write intermediate results on paper and then manually enter them back into the machine to continue the calculations. That is another reason to be glad we live in the remote control you use to operate various devices has also come a long way. Nikola Tesla, famous for introducing alternating current, was also one of the pioneers of wireless control. The scientist named his invention a teleautomaton and demonstrated it on small model boats that he steered using radio waves. Each model had a metal antenna to receive signals, and Tesla sent commands using a special box with a lever and a telegraph key, his version of a remote. The received radio signals closed electrical contacts on the boat, operated the rudder and the propeller, and thus he could steer the craft remotely along the desired course. This idea of remote control, thus, in 1950, a company called Znit Radio presented a television remote that earned an unflattering nickname, the Lazy Bones. The device was bulky. A heavy cable was attached to it, connecting the remote to the television. People who tried this novelty did not take to it much, because the wires got in the way and one could trip over them, which understandably annoyed users. Returning to vertical transport, meet the first passenger elevator. It was installed in New York in 1857 and reached a speed of about 12 meters per minute, quite noticeable for its time, although by modern standards this is very slow, especially compared to today's record of 12 meters per second. This elevator was powered by a steam engine located in the basement of a 5-story building, and at first it was seen more as an interesting attraction than as a household necessity. After 3 years, the device ceased operation because the public did not share the inventor's enthusiasm. Around the same period, Otis Tafts filed the first patent application for the so-called vertical railway. His design envisioned a true car with a bench inside. Later, elevators began to be installed in luxury hotels around the world. Their cabins were turned into miniature rooms with elegant decor, soft seats, mirrors on the walls, and sometimes even a small chandelier. There was always an operator inside who closed the door, after which the cabin began its sometimes rather slow ascent. It was more a matter of skill and presentation than of speed alone. So if there is a question that has puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries, it is this one. How did the ancient Egyptians erect those monumental pyramids? By available accounts, their technical capabilities and construction resources were comparatively modest, especially judged by the tools and materials at their disposal. We do not yet have a precise, comprehensive answer, but there are several curious hypotheses worth attention. One key idea is that the builders employed a clever engineering strategy. They built an inclined, curved embankment as the main structure rose, this piled ramp was gradually lengthened and heightened, as if adding another turn to a giant spiral, or carefully rearranging layers, much like a game of ancient Jenga. How were the heaviest stone blocks raised to such heights? In his notes, the famous Greek historian Herodotus mentioned the use of sledges, rollers, and levers, methods one can imagine as an organized version of tug-of-war, with thousands of people moving a single massive load. He also claimed that construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza lasted exactly 20 years. In addition, Herodotus gave an impressive figure. Allegedly 100,000 people were involved in the work. Does that mean practically the entire population of the country was mobilized? Possibly not. That estimate needs qualification. It is likely that a significant portion of the workforce consisted of farmers who were relieved of field duties during the Nile's inundation. Late 20th century archaeological research has revised this picture. Evidence has been accumulated suggesting the workforce may have been more permanent and smaller in number than previously thought. Instead of a whole horde of 100,000 workers, the project was apparently carried out by a permanent corps of specialists, with a total strength on the order of 20,000 people, supported by auxiliary personnel, bakers. There was an intriguing hypothesis that the pyramids were built not from the bottom up, but from the top down. It proposed that these huge pyramidal masses were originally nothing more than isolated hills, quarry-like mounds. Stone blocks were supposedly taken from these hills, and over time rival engineers turned them into the cultic structures we now call pyramids. Before dismissing such an idea as pure invention, it is worth noting that isolated hills do indeed, whatever the reality, whether ramps were used or carefully staggered shifts, one thing is clear. These structures left a deep mark on history and long settled in the human imagination. Moving from the pyramids to other mysteries of ancient Egypt, one cannot fail to mention the gigantic unfinished obelisk that still rises at the excavation site. Scholars are trying to understand exactly how it was formed. Some believe the stone was separated with simple handheld mallets, the labor of many hands, and its surface worked step by step. However, one expert offers a different explanation. He points to the traces left by the tool during finishing. The pattern on the walls of the trenches surrounding the obelisk looks neat and regular, which makes a purely manual dressing unlikely. According to this specialist, the horizontal bands appear when the tool pauses while removing material and leaves its own impressions on the surface. If one imagines the tool rocking back and forth along the trench's sidewall, it almost sounds like a sign of an advanced finishing technique. At the same time, the expert notes that craftsmen of the dynastic period probably did not have access to such know-how. Another renowned Egyptologist, in his expeditions, did not find the drills themselves, but rather peculiar remnants, crown-shaped cores carved from limestone, alabaster, and even granite. These fragments look like frozen imprints of tools. The cutting tips themselves have not been preserved, but the material remains allow one to judge the shapes and methods used. But the ancient Egyptians did not stop there with their remarkable finds. It turns out they were pioneers of the handheld mirror, the small mirror many people use daily. These objects were not simple utilitarian items. The Egyptians took appearance and hygiene very seriously. They understood the importance of a well-groomed look and strove to keep their bodies and faces clean. In pursuit of a pearly white smile, they invented. Nevertheless, the recipes for ancient pastes are impressive in their boldness. One combined rock salt, mint, dried iris petals, and pepper. Some modern 21st century dentists have tried such mixtures and know. In another recipe, the toothpaste was obtained by grinding ash. There was, of course, no minty scent, and breath freshness left much to be desired. Around the same time, the Egyptians, and finally, as for home furnishings, the decoration of furniture and interiors achieved unprecedented refinement. If one believes that the idea of decorating everyday objects began in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians took that approach to a new, and we mustn't forget the small mats, those cozy floor coverings we sometimes have at home. The same idea occurred to the ancient Egyptian craftsmen. They wove comfortable mats from papyrus, using plant stems and skilled hands. Speaking of tastes and the items the ancient Egyptians prized, they had a fondness for small ornaments and figurines. Their modest collections included statuettes of cats, dogs, and people. Such miniatures were made from a wide range of materials, from simple sun-dried clay to precious gold. The material and craftsmanship largely depended on the owner's wealth. The Egyptians also knew how to cultivate the land, and clearly understood that clean water was vital both for the fields and for livestock. That is why they devised and implemented a whole range of practices and engineering techniques so that the land would yield good crops and the plants would thrive. One of their ideas was the use of plows yoked to oxen. They used two types of plows, a heavy one that cut the soil deeply and made wide furrows, and a lighter one that followed and loosened the earth. After plowing, the peasants broke up the clods, leveled the soil, and sowed it in. To help the grain settle firmly into the furrows, they drove their animals across the field, whose hooves slightly compacted the soil and closed the furrows. However, all that industry and ingenuity would have been useless if the seeds had remained dry like desert sand. That was where irrigation systems came to the rescue. The Egyptians guided water to their fields so skillfully that their methods and solutions were later adopted by other peoples, including the Greeks and Romans. They were no less skilled in construction. Beyond agricultural work, the Egyptians proved themselves as accomplished builders. They dug canals that carried water to farms and villages, making these waterways not only useful but also attractive. It is easy to imagine a walk along such a canal lined with decorative structures and ornaments. Pharaoh Ramses also stood out for his engineering ingenuity. One of his outstanding constructions at Abu Simbel was designed so that the sun entered and illuminated the ruler's statue. We should not forget stepped vaults as one of the architectural techniques used to embellish and reinforce structures. Without this architectural gem, we might never have seen monumental works like the Great Pyramid. The Egyptians knew how to erect buildings that stood tall and proud, thanks to subtle engineering methods. They created vast halls and internal light shafts that took one's breath away. Some temples served not only cultic purposes, but also functioned as astronomical observatories, linking the earthly with the heavenly in the unified design of their builders. In February 1961, 3 mineral enthusiasts set out on. After cutting the stone matrix, the researchers discovered something strange inside that was clearly not typical for ordinary mineral formations. Inside was a cylindrical object that looked superficially like porcelain. A metal roller sat in its center, and around it was a hexagonal casing of copper and some unidentified material. The finders hoped they were looking at an example of an unknown technology some 500,000 years old. Such an artifact could have been evidence of a highly advanced ancient civilization like Atlantis, or could have suggested time travel. Even more fantastic explanations arose. Perhaps the object had been accidentally dropped by future visitors from Earth. If any of these hypotheses were confirmed, scientists would have to rewrite the history of human civilization as we know it. However, not everyone shared the initial excitement, and proponents of alternative archaeology. Then, a group of skeptics prepared photographs and X-rays of the find and showed them to spark plug collectors. These specialists identified the item as a spark plug with corroded metal parts, characteristic of products from the 1920s. Almost 20 years later, one of the original discoverers took the artifact for analysis to the University of Washington, where it was officially confirmed to be a champion spark plug from the 1920s. The stone matrix that enclosed the artifact was initially taken for a geode, but it turned out not to be a geode but a concretion. Such dense formations can form under natural conditions relatively quickly, within a year or a few decades. This is important because such concretions can encase objects that end up inside them, and thereby create the illusion of great age. The notion of an out-of-place object vividly illustrates the phenomenon of pseudo-archaeology. It refers to things found where, by all reasonable expectations, they should not be. Such finds seem excessively modern for the layer in which they were discovered, and are often used to construct sensational hypotheses. Sometimes such artifacts are interpreted as proof of human presence in an era when, by accepted views, humanity did not yet exist. One well-known example is the so-called Baghdad Battery. This find, made by German archaeologists in the 1930s, consisted of the top of the vessel had been broken off and, according to the researchers, was possibly originally sealed with asphalt or a similar material. The first scientist to describe the find noted the presence of 2 different metals and suggested the existence of an electrolyte inside, criteria necessary for the operation of the simplest battery. Although there are no direct confirmations of such technology in ancient texts, researchers conducted experiments by filling the vessel with electrolytic solutions, in particular vinegar and wine, and found that the construction was capable of conducting electric current. If one assumes this really was a 2,000-year-old battery, it might have been used in medical procedures or embedded in statues to create a sensation of vibration and impress viewers. The archaeologist Kennick, who first examined the object, believed it could have been used for the galvanic deposition of metal when coating items. Even under that interpretation, the device's power was small, about 1 volt. So some specialists favor another curious case also occurred in the 1930s on the banks of Red Creek in London, Texas. There a couple, while walking, noticed a piece of wood protruding from a rock outcrop. About 10 years later, their son, intrigued by the mystery, split the rock, and inside found an astonishingly modern-looking hammer. The find again became the subject of discussion and dispute over how an object that appeared clearly modern could have become sealed in such a layer. The discovery attracted the attention of Carl Baugh, a well-known proponent of young Earth theory, who claimed that the rocks surrounding the hammer dated to the Cretaceous period. He took the find as an argument against evolutionary theory and insisted that the hammer was proof of the simultaneous existence of humans and ancient animals. After further examination, scientists reached a different conclusion. The rock turned. Thus, the discovery did not confirm the hypothesis of humans coexisting with dinosaurs. It was an ordinary case of a miner having dropped a hammer several centuries earlier, and nature later hiding it under tectonic deposits. In another region of China, an archaeologist came across several caves that, by all appearances, served as burial places for small beings with large oval heads. Near the sites, rock paintings were found, figures in rounded helmets, depictions of the sun, moon, earth, and stars, connected to each other by groups of pea-sized dots. More than 700 strange stone discs decorated with spiral grooves were also found. The situation became even more mysterious when the discs were sent for examination to a Chinese professor who stated that the grooves represented written signs. According to his translation, the stones bore the story of visitors from another planet, the Dropa, who about 12,000 years ago crashed on Earth and tried to live among humans until local people began to hunt them. However, no concrete evidence supporting this version has been found. The story first appeared in publications of the 1960s and quickly aroused suspicion. None of the named participants, neither the archaeologist, nor the professor, nor even the university where the research was supposedly carried out, left any trace in official archives. There is indeed an ethnic group in Tibet called the Drogpa, but they are ordinary people, not extraterrestrials. There is also no convincing evidence that Dropa stones ever existed. In remote parts of China, there are other strange geological formations known as the Baigong Pipes, but their nature remains a separate topic of discussion. A local researcher found these tubular formations in 1996 on Mount Baigong, and the discovered objects in shape resembled man-made structures. So some people put forward an exotic theory that they were traces of visitors from other worlds. Analyses of their composition showed that the tubes consist mainly of common minerals, though they contained about 8% of a substance that scientists at the time could not identify. Additional specialized tests suggested that these structures had been here long before humans appeared. Later, Chinese geologists visited the site and offered more down-to-earth explanations. It was likely either an accumulation of sedimentary deposits and ground fish. Both options leave room for doubt, but they do not require invoking extraterrestrial hypotheses. In Mexico, a mysterious terracotta head with a hard-to-pronounce name was discovered during archaeological excavations in the 1930s. In its execution, it resembled elegant Roman statues, so scholars and history enthusiasts were puzzled as to how such an object had ended up on the other side of the ocean. For unknown reasons, the discoverer kept the find secret for several decades. The head was removed from a 3-tiered pyramid located about 64 kilometers from Mexico City and was found alongside objects of gold, copper, and ceramics. Advocates of ancient contacts argued that if the dating of the head indeed indicated great antiquity, there were also theories about shipwrecks, in which artifacts and survivors might have been washed ashore, or suggestions that the figurine was a souvenir brought, for example, by Vikings. However, the archaeological evidence for such encounters remains unconvincing. Isolated artifacts have been found, but none has been recognized as irrefutable proof of pre-Columbian contact. As a result, the origin of this head remains one of the unresolved historical mysteries. In Romania, workers digging trenches along a river came across a metal wedge now known as the Iud aluminum wedge, or the Iud object. Mastodon bones, distant relatives of modern elephants, were found nearby. Since these animals lived roughly 11,000 years ago, scientists have suggested that the wedge itself could date to the same period. This find raises questions about how a metal object came to be in such ancient deposits, but there are no definitive answers yet. Surprisingly, the object is made of aluminum, a metal not discovered until the 18th. Producing this material requires significant heating and technical processing, so its very nature is puzzling. The wedge is covered with a thick layer of oxide, the presence of which indicates it has been in that state for hundreds of years. Some believe it to be a fragment of an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Other scientists call the find a hoax, and others suggest it is a human-made object of unknown purpose. A few years ago in Egypt, there was a gruesome discovery that shocked. At first, the remains did not even look like human limbs because of their abnormally large size, but examination confirmed that they were indeed human hands. What was strange was that the burials contained exclusively Egyptian art and traditions contain references to a ceremony in which warriors brought the right hand of a defeated enemy as proof of their victory and demanded gold in exchange. The Egyptians' belief in the afterlife gave this custom an especially sinister meaning. A severed hand meant depriving a person of strength and the ability to act even after death. For the victors, this served as a guarantee of the enemy's final defeat. In the case described, the conflict unfolded between the Egyptians and the Hyksos, who inhabited the territory once called Canaan. Egypt has long been a place of discoveries, capable of changing perceptions of the past, and some time ago, a significant papyrus was found there. If unrolled, the length of the scroll appears to be just slightly more than the height of a skyscraper, comparable to the height of the world. Before the advent of modern electronic writing applications, people used a material made from the pith of the papyrus plant to record information. About 2,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians created on papyrus something resembling a book, in which they set out most of their funerary rites and beliefs about the afterlife. This papyrus is considered one of the most important texts of ancient Egypt, and is still sold in bookstores as a testament to a unique culture. The manuscript itself was discovered in a chamber located to the south of Djoser's pyramid in Saqqara. Djoser is the oldest of the Egyptian pyramids, and not the famous structures of Giza, as most people mistakenly believe. Recently in Saqqara, archaeologists working at the excavations may have come across one of the oldest intact mummies preserved in Egypt. This beautiful and unusually well-preserved mummy, according to researchers, belonged to a wealthy and influential person. It was found in a deep burial shaft covered with several layers of gold leaf, which in its signs of wealth and status were also evidenced by accompanying finds: a decorative headband, a bracelet worn over the chest, and the fact that the body had been embalmed in a tunic intended exclusively for the upper strata of ancient Egyptian society. The most impressive detail of the excavations was that the burial chamber had been sealed with mortar, exactly as the ancient builders had left it 4,300 years ago. This gave archaeologists a rare opportunity to see a preserved resting place in an almost pristine state. It is also curious that not far from this spot, in 2008, one of the so-called lost pyramids was rediscovered. Previously, the structure had effectively vanished. Its destruction spanned roughly 4,000 years. And in antiquity, this area was an important cult center. There, according to researchers, special ceremonies were performed in which high priests presented the gods with the mummified remains of sacred bulls. This tradition is associated with the cult of the Apis bulls. The ancient Egyptians believed these animals were earthly incarnations of the deity of Memphis, and played an important role in fertility rites. The selection of Apis bulls was carried out particularly strictly. They had to be completely black, have a single white mark between the horns, and possess a number of specific characteristics. The chosen animals were revered in life and, after death, carefully mummified and buried in underground galleries. The history of one of the region's pyramids is full of twists. It disappeared around the 19th century after its initial discovery. Its first discoverer was said to be a German archaeologist working in the village of Saqqara. On first inspection, he dubbed the structure the Headless Pyramid. Years later, the desert sands reclaimed the ruins, and excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries were sporadic and That is why archaeologists were so elated when, during recent work, They removed from the base a huge mound of sand, 8 meters high, and finally uncovered the pyramid completely. American archaeologists are excavating in Egypt at a vast necropolis that, researchers estimate, may contain more than 1 million mummified bodies. To date, they have recovered roughly 1,700 mummies, and work continues. The peculiarity of this cemetery is that it is not filled with the burials of rulers or pharaohs. Ordinary people are buried here. According to scholars, these burials date to roughly 1,500 years ago, when the name of the necropolis is unusual, the Path of the Water Buffalo, and may interest those who study the area's map during future visits. Another curious pattern is observed. Alongside the veneration of bulls and buffaloes, the ancient Egyptians also highly revered baboons. At the beginning of the 20th century, archaeologists opened a burial of mummified baboons that became known as the Valley of the Monkeys. Animals were not mummified for amusement. Certain species were considered especially important because they were associated with particular deities. Jackals were linked with Anubis, god of the afterlife, and cats with the goddess Bastet. Baboons were especially honored by the god Thoth, worshipped as a deity of wisdom and as Ra's advisor. Upon close study of how these animals had been kept, archaeologists found disturbing signs. Many baboons lived with prolonged lack of sunlight, showed pronounced vitamin D deficiency, and were not given proper nutrition. This raises questions for researchers about how kindly people of that time treated them. Perhaps even the deities were not pleased with such treatment, but that remains a hypothesis. Archaeological work in Egypt continually yields unexpected finds. For example, human mummies were once found with golden tongues, objects placed in the deceased's mouth based on beliefs about the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed a golden tongue could help the dead speak in the next world, and although that idea seems unlikely today, the period's concern for a person's posthumous fate made some mummies rested in wooden coffins alongside necklaces, ceramic vessels, and gold ornaments shaped like lotus buds and scarab beetles. As a joke, researchers sometimes mentioned modern gadgets, but that is merely a smile amid serious discoveries. And recently, a new temple structure was discovered in Egypt, further adding to the list of mysteries and finds archaeologists face. Scholars tend to think the structure was dedicated to Zeus Cassios. In the beliefs of the ancients, this deity occupied an intermediate position between the Greek supreme sky god and the mountain Cassios itself. During excavations on the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, archaeologists noticed 2 pink granite columns protruding from the ground and immediately suggested that they might have been the ceremonial gateway of a temple. In their view, these gates collapsed in an earthquake many years ago. It should be said that among the ancient Greek gods, there were not only stern and majestic figures. Recently, in a town south of Cairo, it was by no means an item from an adventure story about Frodo, and the ring did not possess any magical properties. An ordinary gold ornament, bearing the image of a deity of merriment. Its official name is Bez. In sacred texts, Bez is often characterized as a happy, plump dwarf. Today, many tattoos are done purely for aesthetics and have lost their original meaning. In ancient Egypt, scholars believe tattoos had a protective significance, and in the Nile region, archaeologists found several mummies with well-preserved tattoos, which is itself rare, since skin usually decays quickly. 2 women had simple designs on their lower backs, and among them were images of that very plump dwarf mentioned earlier. Among other things, and one more entertaining fact. Can we say that the ancient Egyptians created a robot? The answer is, not exactly in the usual sense, but close. They were accomplished astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers, and ultimately created a sort of automated representation. A wooden statue of this deity stood for a long time in the Metropolitan Museum until someone noticed a secret. An X-ray examination revealed a mechanical working system inside the figure. An axle-like mechanism runs from the statue's shoulder to its left leg. When the system is set in motion, the statue raises and lowers its arm. "Hey, pick me, I cried, raising my hand. And what if I told you that those aliens, most often pictured as little green creatures, need not necessarily look alien and could resemble ordinary people on holiday in Europe? This unexpected turn of thought takes us to the Iberian Peninsula, where the locals found themselves at the center of a curious suspicion, and with good reason. The fact is that part of the most significant artifacts that the Iberian culture called the treasures of Villena are made of a metal not found on Earth, essentially meteorite. The set consists of 59 different items: cups, bottles, and bracelets. In total, the find weighs roughly 9 kilograms, about 8 kilograms of which are 23.5-carat gold. For those not familiar with jewelry designations, 23 carats correspond to 95.8% pure gold, so 23.5-carat gold is even purer. The remaining portion consists of impurities of other metals that give the alloy the necessary strength and durability. The set also included silver, iron, and pieces of amber. This ensemble would look perfectly ordinary if not for two items that stand completely out of line. Let us call them imposters. Look at the forged iron bracelet and the hollow sphere. Rusty streaks on the surface of the sphere, and it all began in 1963, when one of the researchers noticed a dark, lead-like metal among the shining bowls and flasks. In places, the metal showed a sheen, but for the most part, it was covered by a crust resembling iron oxide with noticeable cracks. For context, gold does not normally behave like this. It is one of the least reactive metals. It hardly tarnishes and certainly does not rust. To determine the origin of the suspicious iron, scientists turned to mass. The data showed that the nickel content in this iron resembles the composition of iron known from meteorites. In short, the bracelet and the hemispheres are of extraterrestrial origin. Determining their exact age proved extremely difficult, but that is crucial for understanding the find's origin. We need to know whether the dating coincides with the beginning of the Iron Age on the Iberian Peninsula. If it does, most questions are resolved. Historians traditionally divide the past into three main ages: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. For our subject, the Stone Age is not particularly relevant, so it is logical to focus on the Bronze and Iron periods. The Bronze Age began when people learned to produce a durable alloy by combining copper and tin. This allowed significant improvements in tools and weapons. During this period, two technological revolutions also took place that had a huge impact on culture and society: the emergence of writing and the wheel. The Bronze period was followed by the Iron Age, during which iron gradually entered everyday life. Iron, especially after being turned into steel, was easier to work and gave objects better properties compared with bronze. Tools became lighter, cheaper, and at the same time stronger. For a long time, scholars debated the chronology of these artifacts, whether to ascribe them to the post-Larger era, around 1500 or 1300 BCE, or to the final stage of the Bronze Age, the 8th century BCE. However, recent studies lean toward the artifacts having been made roughly between 1300 and 1200 BCE, that is, in the late Bronze Age. This creates a clear discrepancy. The Iron Age began roughly 500 years after the supposed manufacture of these items. Moreover, it remains unclear how ancient craftsmen could have worked with metal that, according to one hypothesis, landed on Earth about 1 million years ago. Although precise chronologies are difficult to explain for now, the craftsmanship of the pieces demands a logical explanation. One working hypothesis is as follows: blacksmiths and artisans of the time may have had access to the fallen meteorite, carefully studied its composition and properties, and then used this material in decorative and other objects. This version explains how skilled handling of an unusual metal could be reconciled with the chronological data and result in the impressive artifacts we see today. Their earliest successes with this extraterrestrial metal came through trial and error. Having mastered the basic techniques, craftsmen began to ornament already finished artifacts, making items noticeably more luxurious. In addition, Phoenicians influenced the development of local crafts by bringing techniques and knowledge, yet the Iberians had been working with metal and shaping pottery long before those newcomers arrived on the peninsula. The advent of new technologies, improved metalworking methods, and the potter's wheel allowed local artisans to produce higher quality goods much faster than before. We have come to the conclusion that some Iberian artifacts are of extraterrestrial origin. One reason for doubt is the language these people spoke. For most modern languages, scholars today can reconstruct a proto-language, a common root. Thus, Latin is the proto. In this light, a natural question arises. If the Iberian language was widely used in the lands that are now Spain, why does Spanish not resemble it? In fact, none of the known modern languages can actually be considered a relative of Iberian. Only a limited similarity with Basque is possible. Primarily in certain features, Basque is classified as an isolate, that is, a language not related to any other known systems. In Europe, it remains the only such language. The Iberian language, however, has still not received a clear classification. The script in which it is recorded has been partially deciphered, but the language itself remains largely a mystery. The alphabet used by the Iberians sometimes seems strange and unfamiliar, as if it were not of this planet. Yet another explanation is possible. When the Phoenicians came to the peninsula, they brought their own script, and the Iberians most likely did not stop at mere copying. They borrowed ideas but reworked them, altering letters and signs until the writing acquired an original appearance, inspiration from outside, but its own path, its own handwriting. Although linguists can to some extent reconstruct the sounds of individual signs, we cannot fully translate the Iberian language. It did not belong to the Indo-European family and ceased to exist more than 2,000 years ago. That is why the sense of a missed opportunity is particularly bitter. We have at our disposal more than 2,000 Iberian inscriptions, carved on funerary slabs, struck on coins, left on pottery, on lead sheets, and even as carvings on cave walls. Yet the meaning of most of these records remains closed to us. We can recognize a few words and fragments, but their significance slips away, and so we can only admire the artistic heritage without fully understanding what was written. If we could grasp the Iberian language, different aspects of their thought and worldview might open up, but for now this remains conjecture. We look at their works like a window without curtains. Iberian culture is known for many outstanding crafts. Artisans produce not only metalwork and pottery, but also finely executed sculptures, textiles, jewelry, and a variety of personal accessories. These objects amaze by the skill of their execution and the aesthetic taste of their makers. At the same time, the production of luxury items depended largely on the rural economy. It was the farmers who made their creation possible. In the core of Iberian society, most people were engaged in farming and animal husbandry. Different regions practiced different forms of economy. In the north, grain cultivation predominated, in the area of present-day Valencia. Emphasis was placed on olive oil production and associated agricultural. We have little detailed information about the everyday lives of most of these workers. Their daily routines remain largely in the shadow of the material record. By contrast, significantly more is known about the upper layers of Iberian society. By the 7th century, BCE groups of wealthy Iberian princes appear, living in relative abundance, trading with the Phoenicians, and eagerly consuming the fashionable luxury items of the era. The privileged position of this elite is evident from their burial practices, which allow archaeologists and historians to judge the status and habits of these people. Cremation was the main burial method among the Iberians, and at the nobles' cemeteries, archaeologists regularly found a variety of luxurious items and funerary sculptures. These objects give us a valuable picture of the appearance and tastes of wealthy people of the time, helping to imagine their clothing, jewelry, and hairstyles. Curiously, beginning in the 6th century BCE, there's a note of the fate of the majority of the population, peasants, craftsmen, soldiers, and laborers, who formed the backbone of society, remains largely unknown and shrouded in mystery. It was a fairly advanced civilization, but over time it essentially disappeared, leaving no obvious traces. Researchers propose various hypotheses about the causes of its decline, and one links it to a powerful earthquake, but this theory has not yet been definitively confirmed. In 1850, the French scholar Auguste Mariette went to Egypt. He cleared the surroundings, and it turned out that the majestic statue pointed to the entrance of an underground structure. Several months later, Mariette finally managed to enter the Serapeum of Saqqara. Inside, the scholar came upon enormous granite sarcophagi that contained the remains of 64 bulls. Specialists are still struck by the techniques the ancient Egyptians used to move and set these massive stone boxes. The Serapeum was erected around 3000 years BCE and was an underground necropolis dedicated to the sacred Apis bulls in ancient Egypt. The complex included a long corridor nearly 150 meters in length, lined with giant stone blocks, with halls on both sides. Some sarcophagi had a mass comparable to the weight of 50 average cars, and all of them showed high precision of workmanship and strict right angles. The surfaces of the boxes are adorned with hieroglyphs and carvings that tell of in ancient Egyptian culture, the Apis bulls occupied a special place and were associated with the god Ptah. They were believed to embody the spirit and wisdom of Ptah, serving as helpers of the pharaoh and protectors of the people. Priestesses searched young bulls for characteristic marks by which the sacred Apis could be identified. These distinctions included a white triangular mark on the forehead, symbolizing divine light. Another sign could be a shape on the back resembling a griffin's wing, as well as a scarab-shaped mark under the tongue, indicating the idea of rebirth. If all these signs were present, the animal was regarded as chosen by the god Ptah and honored as a representative of the royal family. They were given the best care, and people came to them seeking blessings. When a sacred bull died, it was mummified with great reverence and respect. Entering the Serapeum, Marriott noticed roller marks on the floor and discovered 2 horizontal wooden winches. Each of these winches had 8 handles. Later, other investigators noted the presence of double rails laid along the gallery. The burial chambers lay deeper than the corridor floor. To set the heavy coffins in place, workers first filled the chambers with sand so the sarcophagi could be rolled straight over the fill. Then the sand was slowly removed, allowing the boxes to slide and be gently lowered into perfectly hollowed niches in the rock. A stone inscription in the Serapeum stated that in the time of Ptolemy II, around the 247th year of Dunashiri, the precise fitting of the sarcophagi, including angles equal to exactly 90 degrees, is explainable. The ancient Egyptians had long before compiled texts on geometry, preserved in papyri. From this material, it follows that they knew an approximate value of pi and could calculate the volume of a truncated pyramid. If in those times they solved such mathematical problems, it is quite natural to suppose that 500 years later, craftsmen could work stone so as to produce true, flat surfaces. All this sounds plausible, but some have doubts. The size of the found coffins turned out to be much greater than the size of the bulls themselves, whereas pharaohs were placed in rather tight coffins that barely contained their bodies. Moreover, the sarcophagi are carved from granite with astonishing precision, although for ease of work, softer limestone could have been used, which would have significantly simplified the task. Moving massive boxes seems simple, but that is only true in theory. If one person is capable of pulling about 200 kilograms, then to move just one such box would have required, by estimates, no fewer than 250 people. The tunnels in the Serapeum were indeed narrow. They were only 60 centimeters wider than the boxes themselves. Could hundreds of people really have squeezed into such tight passages to drag those cumbersome, massive wooden coffins? Even if that had been possible, how could they have turned a box in a narrow corridor, lowered it into a niche, and placed it exactly in the center without touching the walls? Nevertheless, they managed this work 24 times, and each in addition, the chambers were covered with dust, and there were no traces of lamp soot, which suggests that the work was likely carried out in almost complete darkness. The real purpose of these stone boxes may have been different from the very first naive guess. Long before the Egyptian pharaohs established their rule, the local people already knew how to use the process of fermentation. Fermentation occurs when tiny organisms called yeasts consume certain ingredients, such as starch, and convert them into gas and ethanol. Based on this, someone in ancient Egypt likely placed products like barley, bread. These granite boxes were cut with such precision that they became virtually airtight, and nothing inside could escape freely. When the yeasts inside were activated, they produced increasing amounts of carbon dioxide. The buildup of gas created rising pressure within the stone vessel. The granite boxes were exceptionally strong. They could withstand pressures greater than those endured by, say, a car tire. When granite was compressed under such pressure, the crystals within it generated a tiny electric charge. This effect was possible because granite contains quartz, and quartz is the mineral. Apparently, for the process to succeed, protein from meat or animal parts may have been added to the mixture, perhaps to help the yeasts thrive. Along with the other ingredients, the substrate contained a compound known as alliinic acid, which is necessary for the yeast to continue growing. As pressure built up inside the boxes, the combination of accumulating gases and emerging electricity made them more than just ancient refrigeration vessels. They became powerful energy installations. Over time, the pressure grew so great that the lid sometimes lifted and, with a loud bang, released the contained gas. When the Serapeum was reopened in the 1850s, researchers found old drawings showing a pile of stones placed on top of some lids. This clearly indicates that long ago someone had tried to weigh the lids down with additional loads to counter the gas pressure and prevent the lids from opening on their own. Such a heavy overlay also created conditions under which the quartz crystals in the granite could maintain heightened stress and continue to generate electricity under pressure. If one were to open one of these stone boxes after thousands of years, they would find only the bones of an ox, precisely the discovery Marriott made in the 1850s. The Serapeum was soon opened to visitors after the initial excavations, and the Prince of Wales, Edward VII, even used to host a luncheon with his guests inside one of the sarcophagi, which underscored the site's popularity in that era. Sands and earthquakes rendered the monument inaccessible. Thanks to modern technologies, scientists now have the opportunity to obtain answers to many historical puzzles. For example, a team from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago recently used a special computed tomography scanner to study ancient Egyptian mummies. To do this, they carefully rolled 26 mummies onto a specially prepared platform where the scanner awaited. It made thousands of detailed X-ray images of each mummy and their sarcophagi. When these images were combined, a volumetric three-dimensional image was produced, allowing researchers to see what lay inside: skeletons and individual artifacts. Scientists expect that such images will help better understand the burial practices of the ancient Egyptians that existed more than. Although the scanning process itself lasted only 4 days, a complete analysis of all the collected data may take on the order of 3 years. The researchers working with the materials have already managed to extract a number of personal details about the mummified bodies. One of the museum's best-known exhibits, Lady Shanae A, was a woman who lived in ancient Egypt roughly 3,000 years ago. Researchers estimate she died at about 30-something or in the very early 40s. To give her body stability and preserve her appearance for the afterlife, embalmers filled the space in the neck area with a special filler that helped maintain its shape. Artificial eyes were inserted into the eye sockets so that she would have a gaze in the other world as well. The body was carefully wrapped in exquisite linen. Scanning revealed that the sarcophagus had been made neatly and with considered details. There was a slot in its back used by embalmers when fitting the deceased into the coffin. Artistic elements and markings were visible on the outer surface, including markings for the knees. Apparently, her funeral preparations and burial goods cost roughly as much as a high-end luxury car.